Yeah, so the. And so the applicants. It is pretty amazing. We come here to Johns Hopkins SAIS, they're very able to have such high caliber speakers. And before I introduce our speaker today, I have to say I was a little worried that he was going to go down in history as the worst speaker ever, having talked to everybody but never hit the podium. So actually giving a speech now. The Thomas Enders Memorial Lecture honors Thomas Enders. Thomas O. Enders, who was at various times Gerald Ford's ambassador to Canada, who served as Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America and the Caribbean. And that unit of the State Department did not include Canada. He also served on West European and Canadian affairs as secretary. He was ambassador in Spain, very distinguished diplomat. And the family, the Enders family, has honored us to be able to host this talk here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And I took it over, I think, in 2018 from the great Charles Duran, who wanted to be here and has long been the head of our Canadian Studies program here. He's retiring, so can't make all the talks, which means the quality of the introductions is going way down already. But the quality of the speakers is very, very high. I'm also really pleased that we have with us Dr. Tom Cormack, who is Tom Enders' godson. And on behalf of the family, just wanted to invite you to say hello and just to thank you for supporting the lecture.
Okay, I won't waste your time. My name's Tom Cormack. I'm nephew of Tom Enders, and I just had the fortune of being the nephew, I suppose. And I have a PhD in physics from Princeton University, and I run a small company that makes quantum sensors, and that prepares me not at all to be here, and and I really look forward to it. So thanks very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you. And we do a bit of physics at Hopkins, so maybe we'll have to try and recruit you. You really got to move up in the world from these like second-tier schools like Princeton. Sorry, just kidding. So, Thomas O. Enders Memorial Lecture honors Canada-US relations, and something that we're all very passionate about here. It is the highlight of our spring term here. It's the most important thing I think that the Center for Canadian Studies does, and I am delighted that our speaker today is the Honorable Peter MacKay. People who have followed Canadian politics, and I know some of you are Canadian, will know that Peter MacKay served with distinction in the House of Commons as a member of Parliament. He served as leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. He has served as Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Justice, Minister of National Defense. And I know, having known him for a while, that all three of those matter to him. And I'll leave you to tell your own story, Peter, but as Minister of National Defense, he was committed in ways that I think a lot of politicians today are not, to trying to make sure Canada is making its contribution as an ally at the right level. Let's not talk 2%. Let's talk about just being there and being there strong. He helped us to found the Halifax International Security Forum, one of the world's premier dialogues among allies about the scary world that we live in. When he was Minister of Justice, he was a frequent visitor to Washington, working with the US on counter narcotics, on human trafficking, on human rights issues, on smuggling. When he was Minister of Foreign Affairs, I know every foreign minister says that you love every country you get to, but what you will find when you hear from Peter MacKay is that of all the countries he had to deal with, I do think there's a special place for him in his worldview for the United States. So I can't think of a better speaker. I'd love to welcome him to the stage. Peter MacKay.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be at a forum that commemorates your late father-in-law.
Uncle.
Uncle, sorry. And an impressive, and to say the least, I did a little research, frankly, in anticipation of coming here, and he contributed mightily to the subject matter that grateful to address today with respect to Canada-US relations, having spent time in our country as US ambassador to Canada, and he was a French speaker, I came to learn, who probably traveled our country more than most Canadians did in their lifetime. And he and his wife were truly great friends of Canada. And so I'm honored to speak at this forum in his name. Chris, I have known for some time now, and we served together on something called the Canada-US Law Institute, which is based in Cleveland, which I had the pleasure of attending with him in the past. And it is because of his invitation and his friendship that I'm here with you today. And I appreciate all of you coming. I know that there are other places that you could be, and I also know that you had to endure some significant security coming in, and I apologize for that. I didn't really think that I posed that much of a threat at this university, but it is really with great appreciation to Johns Hopkins University as well that we gathered here. And I want to begin with just a few reflections about both my time in government, but more so the significance of the shared history that we enjoy here in North America. And I think for some Canadians, it is lost on them just how deep and abiding and historical this relationship is. I was very familiar with the United States from a very early age. I had an aunt that was the head nurse at Quincy, Massachusetts General Hospital outside Boston. And so she would regale us with history of the Canada-US relationship. And there's also, I come from Nova Scotia, there's also a particular personal relationship that's felt between our province and what used to be called the Boston States, Massachusetts and other areas along Maine, Eastern Seaboard, that goes back to something that was a very dark period in our history called the Halifax explosion, where two ships collided in Halifax Harbor. And of note, it was the largest man-made explosion up until the explosion of Hiroshima. And it was devastating for the city of Halifax, catastrophic injuries. And America was there. They sent trains of supplies and medical supplies and doctors and nurses. And as a result of that, many kids were orphaned and wound up in the United States, in Boston in particular. And to this day, many of you would know this, Nova Scotia sends a Christmas tree to be erected in Faneuil Hall as a memory of that great relationship. And so I've always believed intrinsically in this special relationship that we are really of the same people, of many of the same origins in many ways. And while immigration built America much faster, it also built our country. I say unabashedly, our country is really all about immigration. And this is a topical issue. It's an issue that is sometimes controversial. My mother came from Northern Ireland. My wife is Persian. And anybody who isn't of First Nations origin is from somewhere, whether it be 5 generations ago or last week. And so that is something, again, that we share, this approach to inclusion, the multicultural approach. You know, the US is the melting pot. We have a cultural mosaic, which doesn't sound as good. You know, you have the Statue of Liberty. We have Halifax Immigration Museum, which was the place that many people who populated our country first arrived, mostly on ships, and then got on trains and went out to find their way in our country. And interestingly, again, and I'm going to make several references to defense and security, but many people who came to Canada and arrived like your Ellis Island turned around a few short years later and went back to fight in Europe in the First and the Second World War. My grandfather was one of them. They came to Canada to make their way, and very quickly they found themselves back defending the country that had taken them and the values of the Western world. Peace, order, and good government we speak of in Canada, which again is not as sexy a phrase, but it really is a defining expression of Canada's commitment to security. And it's a relationship, as I mentioned, like no other. Certainly the ties that bind our countries together, as I said, are deep and abiding, and they go to the very core of who we are and how we present in the world. Yes, of course, our shared presence in North America makes it obvious. We're neighbors. And we have, as is often referred to as the longest undefended border in the world. Try to pass through that border without being stopped. It's not undefended. But as our closest neighbor and friend, and with all of this connective tissue, we don't always agree, nor should we. And that's okay. Because amongst your family, your schoolmates, your friends, between governments, you're never going to get complete agreement. That's the human condition. And conflict, by the way, is also very much part of our shared history. We were born out of conflict. Let's not forget. Both countries came from conflict. Yours more dramatically in a war of independence. And I'm not going to retrace, believe me, all of the history, but it is important to remember that that war of independence deeply impacted the formation of Canada. And the subsequent revolutionary wars accelerated our decision to become a confederacy ourselves and a dominion, and to form what would become Canadian territory. Not necessarily a fear of manifest destiny, but a recognition that we had to, in no simple terms, get our act together, which is exactly what happened. And while yours was a war of independence, ours was much more gradual. Our evolution happened over a longer period of time, and perhaps, I suppose, one would say with a greater deference to Great Britain. We didn't throw tea in the harbor or take up arms, but yours was a divorce, and ours was, I guess, just a mutual division of our records, and we went our separate ways. And yet, it's undeniable that Great Britain continued to impact throughout our evolution, as it does today. Certainly cultural norms, our institutions, our structures, language, traditions. As in America, Canada maintained those ties. And to this day, and in fact, more recent history, we had to repatriate our constitution from Great Britain. And we still, in fact, have those very close ties that are apparent in many of the things that affect our daily lives in Canada. But returning to the period of time for a moment, if I might, that is the War of 1812. I was a Minister of National Defense when we commemorated the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812. And I know we're really looking backward at this point, but that was a pivotal time in our history, often forgotten and overlooked by Canadians and Americans in terms of our history. And that was a real war. I mean, make no mistake about it, there were cross-border invasions and skirmishes. 15,000 Americans died in the War of 1812. 8,000 British, Canadian, Aboriginal people died in that conflict. And there were literally hundreds of thousands of people who were amassed as troops. And there were fights on the water. There were cross-border skirmishes, as I mentioned. There was losses and gains of territory. And as we all know, Americans and certain prominent Americans will remind us that we burned your White House. Not us. It was the Brits. We were there. It was their fault. And we also, as a result of that period of time, gave you your national anthem. Star Spangled Banner. Francis Scott Key wrote that poem while sitting on a hill watching the bombardment of Baltimore. The rockets' red glare and bombs bursting in air. That was the British forces bombarding Baltimore. Now, in our defense, reason we came down to burn the White House, I told this story at West Point. I was asked to address a class of cadets at one point, and I reminded them that the reason that happened was that the Americans had come up across Lake Ontario and basically sacked York, which was Toronto. They went and they burned every public building. They took over the city of Toronto, if you can imagine. Now, rumor has it they were looking for the Stanley Cup. But then, as now, you would not find it in Toronto. So we came down and burned the White House, and so close to capturing the US president. This is true. This is a Cliff Clavin moment. You can look it up. They almost captured the US president, James Madison. He and his wife, Dolly Madison, were sitting down to breakfast as the British forces were approaching the White House. And they took that famous picture of Washington off the wall and they left the building. And the commanding general of the British forces sat down and finished his porridge. That's a true story. So that is real history, live history that's all around us. I became great friends with John McCain, which is one of the great gifts of my life and my time in politics. And when he was visiting one time in Halifax, I took him to a little military museum in the city that's in our citadel, which was a military installation, British installation. And in that little military museum, they have a pewter decanter and crystal candlesticks liberated from the White House as part of what they considered war booty in those days. But in your capital, in the legislature, there is the flag, the British flag that flew over Fort York in Toronto. So I tried to exchange that with John, but he was not having any of it. And so, important to note, we have been on the same side of the battlefield ever since. In our 200 plus years of history, military history, we have been on the same side of the battlefield. We are, of course, members of many of the same global institutions that are there to preserve and preserve peace and prevent conflict. NORAD, NATO, our economic ties pull us together in the G7, G20, Asia Pacific. We have for years built on those familiar ties and institutional ties that make our country strong. And we fast forward through some of the terrible conflicts that we have seen up until recent times, which I'll talk about. But World War I and II, Korea, Bosnia, Serbia, Iraq, Afghanistan. I had the distinct vantage point as Minister of Defense to see the joined up approach that we took in Kandahar, in southern Afghanistan, which was the most difficult part of that conflict. It was the spiritual homeland, the Taliban, that had borders with Pakistan. And it was late in the game when Canada was assigned that particular region of the country. But it was incredible to see, even generations later, after having, served predominantly on peacekeeping missions, how able and agile Canadian and American forces were in working together in the defense of, and I say this with great emphasis, the defense of the innocent people of Afghanistan. And we may have taken different approaches. We shared intelligence. We were building capacity in that country, and it all collapsed, of course, in a smoldering heap. But I'm proud of the schools that we built, the efforts to build democratic institutions and capacity in that country. I will never forget, if I can be personal for a moment, visiting school in Kandahar, and girls. When I was asked, why would we be in Afghanistan, a place you can't find on the map, another excursion, American, Canadian, Western imperialism. It was so girls could go to school. I had to give one reason. Little girls had been prevented from getting an education then as now. And we visited some of those schools, and the enthusiasm and the humanity that was happening as these little girls were thirsting for knowledge. And I remember through an interpreter asking this little girl, I can picture her. I found myself scanning the news as that terrible exodus was happening in Kabul. But I said, what are you going to do with your education? She said, I want to be a teacher. And she said, I go home every night and I teach all the girls in my village what I learned today. And for me, that justified everything that we were trying to do, not the failures, not the awkwardness with which the mission ended, but there will be a generation of kids, young women in Afghanistan that will remember Canada and the United States were there for them. And hopefully we'll see a change again. I fast forward to what we've been seeing just in the last few days, rockets being fired at Israel, of the terrible crisis that's happening in the Palestinian territories. And so when I say we were born from conflict and battle, there is still a pressing need is to have that ability to project into other parts of the world that need our help. And that really is what it's about. And I can say unequivocally, Canada has never, with the exception of crossing this border, has never gone to another country on a fall with an attempt to do anything other than to build a democracy inside that country and leave it better than we found it. And that is something, you know, I think our Canadian forces are very proud of. The Quebec conference at the end of, nearing the end of the Second World War, brought together world leaders to talk about the reconstruction of Europe. And so 75 years ago, fast forward to today, and we still talk about how we are going to perform reconstruction in a place like Ukraine, or Palestinian territories, or other places where conflict has devastated the land. One of the things that I remember distinctly about Afghanistan was all of the demining that we had to do. We had to dig up all these mines that were left by the Soviets, who had also invaded Afghanistan. Graveyard of empires. That country's been invaded more than any other place on the planet. And the same will have to happen in Ukraine, ironically. All of that agrarian society now has been destroyed and filled with landmines that pose a great threat. I remember there was a guy named Irving Schwartz who owned a furniture store in Cape Breton. And he became very involved with Princess Diana against all logic. And he went numerous times to parts of Africa and places and became extremely passionate about demining. Now, the community of Cape Breton was founded because of the seams of coal that run under Cape Breton Island. And he used to tell the story of walking to work one day, and he was approached by a member of the local coal miners union. And the fellow stopped him. He says, "Now, Irving," he says, "we're awful proud of you. We know you're doing good work out there." He says, "But you got to stop talking against our mines." It's not enough for a big present. It's not as funny. The consequential impacts of Canada's relationship with the United States, our military, institutional relationships, our diplomatic relationships. It's trite to say that our national interests will always be 100% aligned. It's just simply impossible given the complexities of our economy, our political systems, and frankly, the political calculus that's omnipresent with changes of government, with issues, day-to-day issues. You know, when Tip O'Neill said that all politics is local, I would extend that out much further. You know, for national interests, all politics is really premised on communication and your ability to try to align to the best of your ability national interests, in addition to what's happening in certain regions and localities. And when one considers the undeniable advantages of the partnership that we enjoy with Canada and the United States, and I must say, I want to point out, I know we have representatives of provincial governments here, our province to state, our chambers of commerce, our Canada-US friendship groups. There are numerous bodies, including the one that Professor Sands represents, that instill that collaboration and cooperative approach that really, to use an old maritime expression, the tide that raises all boats. It is that, again, that intrinsic belief that we continue to grow the relationship to the advantage of both, that we need to constantly revisit and remind ourselves. And our populace, who sometimes can be agitated by certain policies, whether it be softwood lumber, pork bellies, pipelines. There are all kinds of issues that we've encountered over time. I mentioned John McCain. I had the good fortune in my first posting as foreign minister to get to know Condoleezza Rice quite well. And I quickly discovered through the briefings at the Department of Foreign Affairs that there were irritants. Not surprising. Water rights, riparian rights, invasive species in a place called Devil's Lake, LNG tankers through Passamaquoddy Bay, a dispute that is still being examined at the UN over water boundaries in the Beaufort Sea. And yet we were able to have these discussions in very civil environment and be able to move the dial on how we got past that. And look, you know, free trade is the obvious example of how our countries have enormously bent in some directions to come together and to find a common ground. We just very recently, 2 weeks ago, commemorated the life of Brian Mulroney. Brian Mulroney, undeniably, in my lifetime, and I would go further in suggesting that he was probably the prime minister that had the most consequential, substantial relationship with his counterpart. And he would say, and I've heard him say many times, that the second most important job of a Canadian prime minister, after the health and well-being and prosperity of Canadians, is to foster good relations with the President of the United States. And so he did. Whether it was Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Brian Mulroney was able to forge, through his force of will, his negotiation skills, and his anonymity, a relationship that allowed for the greatest trade relationship on the planet to come about. First Canada-US and later NAFTA to include Mexico. And it has endured. It has visited, changed, and adapted as it should be. And it has clauses for dispute resolution. And it may be revisited again, who knows? But Brian Mulroney understood instinctively that Canada, as a smaller economy, could and would benefit, as would the United States, in having this free trade relationship. And it was a contentious issue, believe me. There were many, many people in Canada. In fact, there was an entire election fought solely on that issue. But it prevailed in large part because of the relationship between he and President Reagan. And it continued under President Bush. He was also able to achieve what I think is one of the great accomplishments in his career of leading the charge to end apartheid in South Africa, which again, America, Great Britain, European Union, they didn't think it was something that we should interfere in. And Brian Mulroney famously told his counterparts, Reagan and Thatcher and others, we will be on the wrong side of history if we do not intervene in this human rights violation. And for that effort and others, it brought about change. Nelson Mandela was released. He became president of his country. And the first place he visited on that release was Canada. He addressed our parliament. And so building trust, even through generational traumatic events like wars, like injustices that happen around the world, is premised first and foremost on that trusted friendship and relationship. I walked here this morning, but I went past the Justice Building here, and I remember having meetings there with Eric Holder. I remember becoming just absolutely astounded by how generous Colin Powell was with his time. And I had the good fortune to work with both of them. And there are so many great American leaders who view Canada with such a favorable and open mind, recognizing this integral relationship that we have for the betterment of our people. And so I feel very, very fortunate, and I was enthusiastic about the opportunity to come here and share any reflections on just how important this relationship is and how, like a garden, it must be continued, watered, and tended. And that is incumbent upon all of us, not just elected officials. It's incumbent upon Canadians and Americans jointly as we navigate what is a clearly uncertain and tumultuous time. More than ever, it is important for our countries to pull together and reflect upon that history, but more importantly, what we can accomplish together. And whether it is issues around, Christopher mentioned our border, around immigration issues, controlled goods, the scourge of human trafficking and contraband, the security of our shorelines in Canada and throughout North America, we have massive unprotected coastal areas. And so we can't do it all. We certainly cannot match in any way the military and Coast Guard capacity of the United States, but we do a great deal in concert with one another and sharing intelligence. Started to talk about that in Afghanistan, the sharing of intelligence. Through Five Eyes, to our military, to our diplomatic circles. This is also, of course, of critical importance for the decisions, the informed decisions that leaders have to make. The trade is, of course, again, empowered by the ability of law enforcement, our customs officers, those who work at the border and ports of entry. And again, it is married up and synced up and through technology working better than at any time in our history. I must reference 9/11. Even though we weren't in government at that time, it was the relationship between then Minister John Manley and Tom Ridge that allowed Canada and the United States to respond appropriately, to make the decisions, the invocation of Article 5 at NATO. It was the impetus for countries like ours to go to Afghanistan. And NORAD, which most Canadians, and I suspect it's the same here in America, have no real appreciation of the importance of NORAD. This military alliance, bilateral relationship with headquarters in Colorado Springs and also in Manitoba, allows us to go well beyond just having boots on the ground or ships at sea. It allows us to also patrol the skies over North America. And when 9/11 happened, to show the strength and the trust of this relationship, it was a Canadian, Mike Jelnick, Colonel Mike Jelnick, a Canadian from Manitoba, was in the chair that made the decision to close the skies over North America. That's trust. America and the American Armed Forces trusted a Royal Canadian Air Force colonel to make that call. And that relationship is in the process of renewal, as many of you will know. In particular, and I'll talk for a moment about the Arctic, we share the Arctic. Alaska is there, but Canada has obviously a much bigger landmass with our three territories of Nunavut, Yukon, and Northwest Territories. But the waters are opening to climate change. I first went to the Arctic when I was 17 on supply ships, and I visited all of those small communities. And they were encased in ice in July and August. You barely get in. We got trapped a couple of times by moving ice in this big supply ship. I went back 30 years later as part of what they called Arctic maneuvers with the Canadian forces. All of those waterways were now open. The permafrost had left the ground. There was new fauna. There was an incredible change throughout the environment of the Arctic. And so that creates opportunity in terms of resources potentially and access for our Aboriginal people. And they have what's called the Arctic Rangers that are part of the infrastructure of the Canadian forces. But more importantly, and I preface this by saying this is not a Sarah Palin moment. We can't see the Russians from there, but they're there. They're just across those Arctic waters. And you know what they're doing? Other than invading Ukraine, they're putting military installations there. They're recapitalizing airfields. They're putting up buildings and they're putting missiles in their north. And I'm not saber rattling or saying that we need to do the same. But this idea of modernization of NORAD and protecting ourselves and our sovereignty demands that we put in place sensors, a system of systems, that we have Arctic offshore patrol vessels and some ice breaking ability. And we do all of this in collaboration with the United States. It's protection, it's strength, projecting strength for the purposes of protecting North America. And I'm going to say, in the presence of friends, we're not living up to our billing in Canada at this point. We had to rely on America to take down a Chinese weather balloon. I don't think it was a weather balloon. I think it had another nefarious purpose. But nevertheless, we need to up our game. The most recent budget in Canada that came down yesterday has made commitments, but they're longer term commitments. There is a more pressing geopolitical environment today than I've seen in my lifetime. And so the impetus to invest in security and to make certain decisions around how partner, but more importantly, how we contribute in meaningful ways to the defense of North America has to occur. And our prosperity, our collective prosperity, is premised on security. Remember a time after 9/11 where it was terrorism trumps trade, Well, security trumps trade. Because security is the enabler of people's freedoms, economic and otherwise. And so in our shared history, we have a history that was grown out of adversity and has come completely full circle to this trusted and important relationship premised on security. And I know that I was the beneficiary of the friendship of many great American leaders. And one who I would mention specifically, I've talked about Secretary Rice, McCain, Powell, but Robert Gates was my counterpart. And Robert Gates was previously, as many would know, the director of the CIA. He was very academic and had come from that world, but was a true patriot. He served 8 presidents by the time he completed his time at the Department of National Defense. And he was a great man and generous with his time and his tone. And I remember famously, we both happened to be in Afghanistan on Canadian Thanksgiving, which again, my Canadian friends here will know, falls on different dates. We have a different date for our Thanksgiving. And I think it's probably safe to say it's a much bigger deal in America in terms of Thanksgiving. It's more celebrated than it is at home. But he was now serving under the leadership of President Obama. And we quickly came to appreciate that he had done something rather unprecedented. The government had changed in the United States, and he had remained as the minister, as the Secretary of Defense, which I thought was remarkable and a tribute to his capability. But here we are in Kandahar province at this tiny little outpost, and they arrived, his entourage, in much bigger helicopters than ours, and a much bigger entourage than mine. But as we sat down in this tent to have a bilateral and to share information of what was happening on the ground in Kandahar, all of a sudden, a group came in the tent and they were bringing us pumpkin pie that they had brought from America to celebrate the Canadian Thanksgiving. And I thought that was just absolutely remarkable. And I thought of it a year later when we were hosting the Organization of American States in Banff, Alberta. And somebody had told us that it was Robert Gates' birthday. So we're in Alberta. I went out and I got him a nice pair of cowboy boots and a box of Cuban cigars, which he couldn't buy. But those friendships endure. And those friendships, I tell you this, not to drop names or to trivialize it, but that relationship that I was able to form with Robert Gates paid huge dividends, because I referenced helicopters. Canada had too few helicopters, and we were taking casualties at an alarming rate in Afghanistan because of our proximity to the Taliban, and we were just under-equipped. We had armored vehicles that were light armor. We had insufficient helicopters to evacuate injured personnel, to get them out and to Landstuhl, Germany for treatment. And so in one of the bilaterals, I spoke to Robert Gates about this, and he said, we have 6 helicopters that we're set to take delivery, and we're going to send them to Canada. Yeah, we had to buy them, but we jumped the queue. And there were numerous occasions where we were able to do that. We were able to bring about a greater accelerated procurement of necessary military equipment. Again, in large part premised on just the friendship and the recognition that helping us was helping them, and vice versa. And as I referenced Brian Mulroney, I think subsequent leaders of Canada, ministers, were able to accomplish much more, not just based on the need or the obvious, we were in the fray together, but the recognition that Canada and the US have such similar DNA, values, purpose, people. And at the end of the day, that's really the most important part of this equation. It's the people to people relationship that is able to bring about the best results. And so from our respective governments and working with various ministers, working across our professional public service, I think we are seeing huge challenges on the horizon. But I want to close on a confident note, an optimistic. I've had the chance to step away from politics and perhaps look at things from a different vantage point, but I'm always impressed by the commitment of people who work in our public service, by people who work at the state or provincial level, who have visits like we had this morning from the Premier of Manitoba, the new Premier of Wampanoag. And that investment, time and energy, personal commitment is what is keeping this relationship strong. And whether it's the protection of the Arctic in the future, whether it is the preservation of our trade and open borders, whether it is the building up of our institutions against the vulnerability of those who do wish us harm. Cyber is yet another example of the accelerated technology, but a place where we need to lean in and work closer. And I, for one, feel very strongly about the fact that we should be doing more on climate together in a North American approach. I say that because we're not going to hit our targets. We're just not. And I think we're wasting time and fooling ourselves to keep putting artificial numbers before the population or punishing them with pernicious plans that just don't work. And until such time as the countries who are truly the big polluters start exhibiting more commitment to lowering greenhouse gas emissions, our country in particular is whistling past the graveyard. We don't have a big manufacturing footprint. We have massive forests that probably make us a carbon sink. We're at 1.6 in measurements. I think we're probably closer to neutral. And when we had an opportunity to do what the United States has done, and that is provide the world, our allies, with liquefied natural gas, which is the transition fuel, we took a pass. Again, this is not a partisan comment. It's a lament for the fact that we have the third largest reserves of fossil fuel in the world. We can refine them into liquefied natural gas and provide them to the big polluters, like India, like parts of the Asia Pacific, like parts of Europe, and they want it. And they'll pay for it, which is okay, because we can in turn take those payments and put them into new technology like solar and wind and hydrogen and waste to energy and many of the incredible breakthroughs that are happening in the world of energy transition. But it's liquefied natural gas that'll get us there. There's 30 different pipelines right now that cross the US-Canada border. And so we're providing you with raw materials that you in turn share with the world and profit from. And we need to get back to a place where Canada is also sharing in this opportunity. So it's an important part, in my view, of future government's ability to have a more collective North American approach, just as Brian Mulroney and George Bush did around acid rain. They were able to sit down and hammer out an appropriate response to a real issue caused by acid rain and our waters. We have the Joint Board on Water over the Great Lakes. We work together in so many different policy areas where smart people, public servants, interest groups, NGOs come together and bring out a collective response for our countries. And so I want to sort of conclude my remarks again on a constructive and positive note, and saying that the shared priorities Canadians and Americans continue to enjoy really fall to you, the next generation, to pick up where past leaders have left off, and quite frankly, done a pretty decent job of blazing a trail and continuing the momentum that has existed for over 200 years in our relationship that brings us to a pretty good place compared to just about anywhere else. We have Russians and Americans as our neighbors. You're our best neighbor. That's not a stretch. We have global influence, less so than America, but similar responsibilities. Fundamental ties that bind remind us daily that we're always going to be better as a collective, stronger together, as the saying goes. Mutual reinforcing interests and values that keep us on that path, guiding principles that will keep us close. I have no doubt. And so in this age of anxiety, this age that we're living of conflict and uncertainty, a world that really is more on edge than we've seen in decades, we need to find it within ourselves to continue the commitment to this personal, professional, and national relationship between Canada and the United States. It is unquestionably the most important relationship on the planet, through thick and thin. And so I'll conclude there with thanks again to Christopher, to this great institution, and to all of you for spending time here today. Thank you very much.
Well, the downside of coming to a school is that people ask questions, and
Perfect.
we've been training them to ask really tough questions. I'll open the floor to anyone wants to make a comment, ask a question. Someone brave?
I like that. Why don't we just, I'd
You
like
can
it to
say
be more
your-
controversial, more,
I'm gonna move the
Conversation.
camera.
Yeah.
But Alex Giordano, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, thank you, Mr. MacKay, for being here. I have a question based on something you said in your interview with Vashi Kapelos recently
sure.
on Iran. US and Canada both are united in their support of Israel. We saw a few days ago Iran attacked Israel in an unprecedented fashion. What do you think Canada can do within its own resources and capabilities as a middle power to deter Iran while working in conjunction with the Americans?
It's a great question and extremely complicated one, as you put it. And I declare a bias in the sense that my wife is Persian. She was born in Iran and has family there and is very, very worried by what is happening. But she is also very pro-Israel and has an intrinsic understanding of how oppressive the Iranian regime is. The Islamic Republic, as she refers to them, is completely different from the values and the pursuits and quite frankly, the aspirations of the Iranian people. Canada broke off diplomatic ties with Iran years ago. In fact, I was foreign minister when we closed their embassy. And so the ability to influence the Iranian regime by Canada directly without doing it in concert with other countries is pretty negligible, to be frank. Sanctions have had some impact, but just as we're seeing with Russia, if other countries are willing to buy Iranian oil, the way India and Pakistan are buying Russian oil, as is China, it continues to fund what they're doing, which is fostering unrest in their region, in other parts of the world, including here in North America. The Iranian regime has very long and pernicious tentacles, and they're involved in things like foreign interference that we're studying right now in Canada. So I'm not trying to avoid the question. It's a very difficult task to try to influence the Iranian regime, not talk about regime change. To support the Iranian people, I think, is one of the more important things that we can do. And I don't think we, Canada, US, collective, other European Union countries are doing enough to support groups inside Iran and the diaspora who do want to bring about change, democratic change. They had an election recently, in Iran. And I think the final number was something like 13% of Iranians actually took part in the vote. And the election result was inevitable. Khomeini was re-elected as the supreme leader. The unprecedented attacks that we refer to, 330 missiles and drones directed at Israel, and what will the response be? That's also worth unpacking, whether Israel will strike in kind and hit strategic targets, or use the Mossad perhaps to do a more surgical strike, remains to be seen. But if it destabilizes the regime to such a degree that the people of Iran are motivated again to rise up, that may be something that Canada can participate in a modest way. I remember the second last time the Iranian people took to the streets. And my wife's a Farsi speaker, so I remember it was just after President Obama had been elected, and there was footage on the news of students, mostly in the streets, before they were cracked down on, saying "Obama, Obama." I said, "Oh, isn't that interesting? They're chanting the name of the U.S. president." She said, "No, that's not what they're saying. They're saying, are you with us or are you with them?" And I never forgot that. We need to send a clear signal to the Iranian people, the Persian people, who are proud, who have, undergone an unbelievable, terrible transition back to this regime from a time in the 70s, and it wasn't perfect by any means under the Shah. But they went to hotels and dances, they had alcohol, they had values that were very much akin to ours. Some of the top universities in this country, the top students are from Iran. They're a formidable people, and they are victims of their government. They don't like to hear that, but they are absolutely the meat in the sandwich between what the Iranian regime is doing and the impact that that's having throughout the region. So Canada can play a role, but only a multilateral role with other countries.
Follow up or? All right, great, thank you. William.
First, thanks so much for being here today and delivering the lecture. Following up kind of from that question, or in a similar vein, you mentioned just now how you would hope that Canada might take a more active or involved role, in whatever capacity that ends up being in supporting, the Iranian population. I'm curious, being from Canada, I'm sure you'll know the famous Indigo chapter's kind of slogan, "The world needs more Canada," that they kind of plaster everywhere. And I think that the Trudeau government has drawn a lot of criticism for maybe talking a lot about Canada reemerging on the international stage and taking a more active role and living our values. But the common critique of that is that has just been talk. And so if you use the model of, the world needs more Canada, I'd be curious, where do you see our global impact being, especially when we've seen time and time again to be unwilling to commit to defense, or when the US asks us to go to Haiti and we choose not to go to Haiti? Yeah.
So, that's a great question. And I have always made it the practice, both while in politics and post-politics, not to criticize my own country when in another country. But there is a problem when we overpromise and underdeliver. And, the expression "Canada's back," I found personally very offensive. Because on our watch, we were in Haiti, we were in Afghanistan. We provided troops to a number of, smoldering conflicts in other parts of the world. And quite frankly, we were on track to supply liquefied natural gas to the world. And a lot of Albertans, I think, are highly unhappy. And there's probably more regional division in Canada than there has been since the Quebec referendum. And so we have to take a long, hard look at ourselves and try to deal with some of those issues before we can really play that role that we want, and in fact, that the world does want from Canada, whether it be diplomatically, whether it be in efforts to help quell terrible crises, violence like we're seeing in Haiti. And on more civilian-related efforts to respond both diplomatically and with aid. We responded to Haiti because of an earthquake, not because of an uprising of criminals. And, I think we took a much different approach to some of the conflict areas than others, including the Americans, that frankly was quite effective. Because we would go to leaders within a region like Afghanistan, to use that example again, and not say, "Here's what we're going to do for you." It was, "What do you need? What are the things that we can provide that would be most needed?" Whether it's building, hydro capacity or water, whether it's recapitalizing some of the infrastructure that you need to improve your communities. So I'm not suggesting it's entirely a return back to how we did things before, But, you know, the expression, doctor, heal thyself, if we want to be taken seriously, if we want to have that positive impact that I think Canada is rightly known for, we have to talk less, do more. Simple terms to put expression back to you. I think it's far better, in fact, to be over delivering rather than announcing it or cutting a ribbon or saying this is what we're going to do. It's just to go and do it. And there are a lot of very ambitious, highly educated people like yourself, William, that can help implement those policies in a way that will help kind of put the shine back on Canada. I mean, reputations and relationships ebb and flow. And, you know, I'm certain that Canada is going to, in a future time, play a more significant role than we are today.
Richard Nimijin is a visiting professor. He's from Carleton University. So just warning you that he knows his stuff.
Yeah, I live here. I'm still at Carleton in Canadian Studies. Curious about teasing out some of your ideas about the balance between shared trust and collaboration and sovereignty, and both conservative and liberal governments have had to deal with a variety of cross-border security issues, policing, you know, C-23 or the ability of police to go into other countries. And there's collaboration perhaps, or pursuit of common goals, but also questions of sovereignty and rights. So I'm wondering how you would think about balancing those issues, you know, or Indigenous peoples living in Canada and Jay's Treaty. When do we go more for collaboration? When do we think we are different?
So Richard, I would put it this way. It's not a big muscle movement within the justice system or within Aboriginal reserves that sometimes do span a border, as you know. It's especially with law enforcement. I was a prosecutor in another life, and I dealt with a number of cases where we had to extradite, in some cases, First Nation people who had committed crimes in Canada or vice versa. And US Marshals and RCMP or state, provincial police would work very closely and very practically to make that happen with, you know, keeping in mind that in some cases we did have different laws. But for things like extraditions, for things like the application of, you know, tobacco legislation or drugs, for example, weapons, various forms of contraband, it is really that joined up relationship at a state provincial level, more so than anything the federal government can do. They can do it in supportive ways in terms of customs. But it isn't a legislative framework that needs to be changed as much as, in my opinion, this continuous working relationship. And, you know, along that border, I forget what the number is now, it's staggering, $2.4 billion of trade daily. Think about that. Over $2 billion in trade in terms of sheer volume of goods and services and people moving across that 5,000 mile, 8,000 kilometer border. And how much people, time, infrastructure resources we're building, as you know, we collectively are building the Gordie Howe Bridge, which, by the way, I think is poorly named. I'm a huge Detroit Red Wings fan, and I loved Gordie Howe when I was a kid, but nobody crossed Gordie Howe. So the practical reality is, you know, those law enforcement communities, like our military, have long-standing relationship from the, you know, leadership on down, those who are day-to-day on the line. And frankly, there's always, you know, in a border and in countries this big with a very active criminal element, it's hard. There's lots of places that, you know, I joked earlier that it isn't completely undefended, but there are many places along the border where there's nobody there. And so for things as dark and dastardly as human trafficking, it's sophisticated. they know the points of weakness. So the only way is through greater technology, collaboration, resource. Something like the Roxham Road issue of, safe third parties. That was something that required a bit of a legislative tweak, but it was really, the president and the prime minister that said, okay, we're going to dedicate efforts to fix this, including necessary resources, and put a physical barrier there. So I'm very interested in this issue, and I'm not trying to oversimplify it. I do think it comes down to the personnel on that front line.
You spoke wonderfully about the many Americans you worked with over the years. I hope you don't mind my asking, how damaging would it be if Trump were reelected? How concerned are Canadians about a Trump presidency?
I knew I wasn't going to get out of here without that. No, it's a great question, and it's one where Canadians are very seized of and nervous. I referenced NAFTA and the USMCA, as it is now known, and some of the, troubling comments that have been made or attributed to the former president. Including countries like Canada are going to have to go it alone, and if they don't pay their 2% of NATO GDP defense spending. So it's in our news constantly as we get closer and closer to November. The good news, bad news is we're a little bit more prepared, I think, than the last time. And in spite of who occupies the White House or 24 Sussex, actually nobody's in 24 Sussex right now. Those two offices are only part, they're a big part, but they're only part of the relationship. The institutions like law enforcement, military, commerce, climate, right? That to me is the more positive path that we're on, undeniably. Yes, personalities matter. And listen, it's not the first time that we've had presidents and prime ministers that didn't get along. Kennedy and Diefenbaker famously didn't get along. Pearson and Johnson. But we've had more recently relationships that did. George Bush Jr. and Stephen Harper got along very well. Clinton, Chrétien, Obama, Trudeau. And so that sets a high bar when the leadership is demonstrably working together. But I'm more than confident that the other institutional ties that we have will prevail always. Richard Sanders.
Thank you.
Richard has been to Halifax many times.
Yes.
As a security firm.
Yeah.
Since you've been a politician and a very very distinguished one, I hope you'll permit a political question. The Conservative Party is now led by Mr. Poilievre, who comes from a pretty hard-edged variant of conservatism. Your roots are more in, I guess, what they used to call red Toryism. I guess if the polls are to be believed, we might see a change of government in the next month or year. How are these different strains likely to be resolved, and what do you think the Canadian people are actually kind of looking for if they get a conservative government in power?
Well, I mean, the short answer to the last part of your question is fiscal probing. I think you would see a much different approach to the economy and rein in spending and expansion of public service. But let me just come back to some of your descriptors. I think, having worked with Pierre previously in government, I think he does come from, we're all sort of tied to our roots. He came from Western Canada, as did Stephen Harper. Actually came from Ontario, but he spent his formative years in Calgary. So there's a different perspective that no doubt informs some of his views and some of his plans for Canada. But I don't think that he is of such an ideological bent that you're going to see, a transformation of the way or the trajectory that our country is on, certainly in terms of the relationship with the United States, since that's our subject today. And I don't think Canadians, and I say this, being a partisan, should be afraid. I mean, I lived through all those early campaigns after the unification of the conservative movement, and oh my God, there'll be soldiers in the streets, and Christopher and I were talking a little bit about political advertising, how just over the top it's become. And Canadians, I think, do sometimes kind of wince a little bit when we see political advertising in the US. We're not far behind. We're headed rapidly in the same direction in terms of campaigning. Yeah. And it is going to be very much, and I'm starting to feel like my grandfather, but it is going to be up to the next generation to change the tone. Having said that, I mean, I think one of the great American examples was John McCain when he ran against President Obama and lost, and was magnanimous in that loss. And it was jarring for a lot of people to see that, classy, deferential respect to an incoming president. So if there's a change in government, I personally think there will be, based on polls and just based, frankly, on, a decade in power is sort of the natural best before date, where even if you're doing a good job, Canadians will say, okay, enough. We want to try something new over here, lemony fresh, something shiny. US system, of course, only allows, and it's a much different system as you're familiar, only allows 2 terms. We've had 4-term prime ministers in Canada. Current prime minister's been there 3 terms. Predecessor was there 3 terms. So the chances are, I personally, and don't quote me on this, I got in trouble before down here.
Yeah.
I think Justin Trudeau's going to leave. I think he's going to announce that he's leaving in the next few months. And I think there'll be a Liberal leadership contest, probably an election next spring would be my guess. And that's all it is. It's a guess.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'm a student here at SAIS, my first year, and I hail from Vancouver, so thank you so much for coming. You mentioned in your speech about how Canada's been rapidly changing since when you were about my age, when you went to the Arctic, and it's completely different now. And recently, or at least last year, Canada recorded that it had a million immigrants come to Canada. And
Thanks for coming.
And seeing this kind of like demographic and environmental change to our country, how do you see Canada's role in the future changing or persevering into, I guess, the next decade or 2?
So there's a couple of really important points that you made there. It's a great question. I'm, as I said, pro-immigration, but it has to be calibrated to the economy and the housing and the economic well-being of both new immigrants and our existing population. I think it's 1.3 million over the last 16 months or so, which to me doesn't really jive with our economy and our performance and our employment needs, and it's a sensitive topic, but it's a practical, important discussion that has to happen. Vancouver, by the way, and British Columbia is, the leader in our country in terms of the steps that they've taken, some good, some bad, in addressing climate change. By the way, you can't drive an electric vehicle from Vancouver to Calgary because we don't have the necessary charging stations and infrastructure. So we're a bit over our skis on some of the climate change initiatives. And that's why I say, again, repeating myself, that liquefied natural gas is that transition that's going to get us there, not by 2030 or 2050. It will allow us to prosper, creates jobs. I mean, one of the biggest regrets that I have from our time in government, when we left in 2015, the Energy East pipeline and the Trans Mountain pipeline were almost to the point of no return in terms of getting them to the coast, to Tidewater. And the incoming government changed the rules and regulations of the game. They said, no, downstream calculations, cost of production, we're putting a halt on these projects. Imagine a world in which Canada is exporting from both coasts liquefied natural gas into the world economy at world price, clean, important, ethically produced oil and gas, which is low emission, because, you know, I cringe when I hear people, you know, bashing Canadian oil production. It is the best in the world in terms of environmental respect and compliance. If you go to the oil sands in Fort McMurray, which I have many times, it's close to the Canadian Forces Base Cold Lake. Territory around those oil wells is pristine. There's elk and wildlife and fauna and trees as far as you can see. You don't fly over these territories and see, you know, oil bubbling up from the ground. It used to be that way, but they've captured it. Plus, they're using carbon capture and storage to reduce emissions. They're cleaning up those tailing ponds. I mean, look, there's always a way to portray things in a very negative way. Greenpeace got off for years raising money in Europe by showing, you know, baby seals being bashed. That's been outlawed, prohibited in Canada for 40 years. They're not bashing baby seals in Newfoundland. But you can get those images on the internet and say, oh my God, we got to stop this. So anyway, that's a long rambling answer, but I think what you're going to see, even in the transition to a new government, if that happens, policies that are not wildly fluctuate, but I think on energy, you will see a significant change, at least coming from government. But it's not just government, right? It's a substantial billions of dollars to build the necessary infrastructure. Refining, you also have Aboriginal land claims. You have to get across the territory of Quebec if you're going to build it to the East Coast. But I come back to, where would we be today in terms of our economy? Where would the world be today if they weren't reliant on Russian gas in Europe? They're building coal-fired generation in India and Pakistan and China. Now they're building more, you know, smog belching factories, energy generation in those countries. If we could give them natural gas at market price, then we could talk. Then we could actually say, yes, Canada is doing something. But kind of ripping our shirt and saying, be more like us, they say, well.
A question from one of our distinguished alum, Josh Baker, who's now with the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies.
Thank you for being here today, Mr. MacKay. My question's for your defense background, or for you to reflect on your defense background. Sure. What do you think needs to change within Canada's strategic culture to actually take defense seriously now and going forward? Because the Washington or the NATO summit's coming up as right now, and for the next several years, we are still going to be in the quadrant of shame. You know, less than 20% of our 2% on defense military hardware acquisition, and we're not spending the 2% that we've signed on to. The current administration, in my view, loves to talk about things that we as Canadians have done 80 years ago. But Washington wants to know, what are we doing that's new? And we're not doing anything. In my personal opinion, we're not doing anything that's new given the changing circumstances as we're seeing them unfold today. And I'm not convinced that if there is a change of, or when there is a change of government in Ottawa, the future Tory administration will take defense seriously to the same extent that it needs to be, because of trying to balance the fiscal books and trying to get our spending in order.
Yeah, that's fair comment. And, you know, I still bear the scars of having advocated for the purchase of new fighter aircraft during my time. We were on track to hit 2%, in large part because of Afghanistan and purchasing of tanks, 777s and armored cars. And we were spending at an alarming rate. And as you'll know, in the defense world, the complexities of sometimes the contracts and the procurement and the delivery, it just takes years, the production of a sophisticated 5th-generation fighter aircraft. Having said that, the bureaucracy within the Department of National Defense is sometimes cross-threaded with our Public Works Department, our Industry Canada, our Treasury Board approvals, and therein lies a bit of the problem. You know, Stephen Harper and Jim Flaherty were giving the department that I ran more money than they could spend. We couldn't spend it, and we'd have to give it back at the end of the fiscal year. And so that bureaucratic malaise is part of the problem in the trajectory to 2%. Because you have money, you know, coming in, you say, oh, this is great, we're gonna get more next year. Oh, wait, we have to give $1 billion back because we didn't spend it this year. So, I mean, I'm grossly oversimplifying the problem, but that is an issue. The second more important issue is the priority of government. Priority of the current government is not to spend on defense, clearly. And that's not a partisan observation, it's just fact. The recent defense update sounds good. But most of that money is earmarked for after the next election,
The
which is
election
presumptuous, or more troubling, 10 or 15 years. You know, the sort of mere passing reference to submarines. If Canada committed to building submarines or purchasing them or doing them in a concert with other countries like Germany, for example, that would get us to 2%, right there. That one commitment, and we need them, by the way. We need submarines. So it requires, and it's very sort of cliche, but they need a champion inside government. They need somebody constantly advocating. The bigger, more immediate issue is recruitment and retention of Canadian forces. And that's frankly going to take even more effort than to fix the procurement problem, because not unlike other militaries, the institution itself has been under attack for certain problems. And I'm not diminishing for a second the offensive criminal behavior in some cases of certain members of the Canadian Forces. But you can point to that in almost any institution. It doesn't run like a culture through the military. It doesn't. I mean, I feel confident in saying that. We ask young people who join the Canadian Forces and those who currently serve to sign on the dotted line for unlimited liability. To say we are willing to die for our country. That is extraordinary and not something that people take lightly. And they're feeling right now that the institution itself is diminished, is broken. Every time there's a story on the news, it exaggerates because they hear about one incident, but they hear about it 11 times that week. And it is creating a real culture shift away from service before self and the traditions of the Canadian Forces. So, I mean, I did the same to your, critique. We live too much in the past. I mean, modern warriors are going to be much different. I saw in Afghanistan, young men and women operating highly technical equipment, whether it was drones, mine clearance equipment. And you know what a lot of them told me? They said, I became very proficient at this because I played video games. I felt like, telling my father that because and I'm, I got a 12-year-old that spends time online. But truly, those technological changes, we will see in our lifetime probably a move completely away from piloted aircraft. We saw what was happening just days ago in Israel. Drones, submersible drones, marine drones, all of that is going to play a big role. Space, weaponizing of space is here. It's happening. Online, pernicious cyber attacks that can paralyze our critical infrastructure. We need the best minds bringing their skill set to the defense of our country. We have something called Communication Security Establishment. And nobody knows about it. Nobody knows what they do. But they are tasked with the important and critical responsibility to protect our country from cyber attacks. And so these are expensive, but critically important, and I'm coming back to the same place I started. It has to be a priority for government, and it has to be communicated passionately and often in ways that make it an attractive pursuit as a career, and that Canadians, like Americans, say, yeah, we need to do that. You know, we need a dental plan and we need institutional daycare, but we really need national defense. It's a priority. And you don't have to look very far more than the nightly news to say, yeah, we do. We're not hearing that from government. Thank you.
So, two things. I'm going to ask my faculty colleague, Amy Porges, to ask a question, and I'm going to remind you that Bev Phillips will kill us both if I don't get you to your plane after. So that Amy's going to ask a very intelligent question that will not go on.
It'll be short.
It'll be short, but you, I want to keep an eye on, so.
Okay, see, I don't have to go to question period anymore. They can shut you down in 30 seconds.
This is, okay, so this is a question about differences between the US and Canada. Here in the US, they have the Biden administration enthusiastically promoting climate change mitigation, transformation of the new clean energy economy, and it really depends on, guess what? Mining. It depends on rare earths, it depends on nickel, it depends on copper, it depends on a lot of stuff that exists in great abundance in Canada, and it exists here as well. There's lots of lithium in the US, turns out, but you know, the problem is getting it out of the ground, because ask people who live anywhere near a mine, ask Democratic voters in Nevada, they'll say, oh no, not in my backyard. How is it that in Canada, somehow Canadian political culture, which it's got to be a political culture difference. It's an economic difference, it's a political culture difference. How is it that Canada is so enthusiastic about mining? And also there must be, that goes along with this, a culture that's more oriented toward permitting of mining compared to the United States, where the big thing is like, do another 5-year study and then maybe we'll say yes.
So Amy, I hate to tell you this, but it's not.
Oh.
It's not that range at all. And it's a problem because it's a contradiction. Just like in the United States, we're going to rush headlong into becoming more reliant on batteries, on wind, on solar, all of these other alternative energy sources. And we should. But we in Canada, even more so than the US, we're an Arctic country. It gets damn cold up there.
Mhm.
And we're not going to be able to rely on batteries or the alternative energy sources right now. We're just not. We're not there yet. Technology has not taken hold to the extent that it is going to completely replace fossil fuel, and in some cases coal. There's states and provinces in North America that are still using coal. But you're absolutely spot on. What's happening in the US is happening in Canada too. You can't get a permit or a license or approval for a mine. There's overlapping jurisdictions in terms of the approval process between provinces, municipalities in some cases, and the government of Canada. And it just doesn't fit, because if we're telling Canadian, American, European, other countries that we're going to go all in on batteries, do you know who controls, either in their country or in Africa, the majority of lithium, copper, manganese, all of these critical minerals that are necessary to build a better battery? It's China. And are we going to rely on their goodwill to sell us sufficient batteries to, do our part to meet Paris climate commitments? They're not. They're not doing that at all. So again, we're completely out of step with what we're hearing and what's actually happening. We have something called PETA, which is the Extraction Industries Global Conference in Toronto. And I heard it from Australians, South Africans, everyone saying, what the heck is going on in Canada? You have all of these minerals, and that's putting aside the issue of liquefied natural gas and fossil fuels. You have all of these critical minerals that we need, that the world needs, that we want to help. We're willing to invest and come here, direct foreign investment, but we can't get it done. It takes 8 years to put a shovel in the ground.
So when the Conservatives take over, will they change that?
Yes, they will. I'm absolutely sure of it. Not throw caution to the wind and say we're not gonna look at the environment anymore, but look, we have to make things, we have to manufacture things, we have to have the ability to grow our economy for immigration, for the existing, population. We can't just be on the sidelines. And one of the things that came out of COVID, that, there wasn't much good that came out of COVID, but the experience that we were able to shift our economies and start manufacturing things that we needed. And you recall the phrase friendshoring,
Mhm.
we're gonna bring things back, start to manufacture more at home. It didn't last. It didn't. It's not in Canada.
Well. I wish we could end on a happier note.
I know, I mean, talking about things that can't last,
But the Capitals made the playoffs.
Well, yeah, all right. Peter MacKay, this was an outstanding lecture, just what we hope for with the Enders Lecture every year. I really want to thank you for both the talk and the engagement with the audience. You can see it's a very smart and challenging and diverse audience. I hope we did your uncle proud. Thank you, Tom. And I want to say a special thanks to Deja Thomas. She is here in the backdrop. She's responsible for the food, but she also made sure the cameras worked, everything worked. I have no technical competence. She's been brilliant. Thank you very much, Deja. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you again next year.